It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Massimo Faggioli from Villanova University. He's going to talk about the crisis in the reception of the Vatican II Council in the USA. Señor Faggioli va a hablar sobre la crisis de la recepción del Vaticano II en los Estados Unidos.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy for the invitation. This conversation started 1 hour and a half ago at Villanova when we had our Pope Francis conference with Joaquin, with Antonio, and so I'm very happy to be here. I didn't choose this picture that was there before. But it's appropriate, so I like it. And so just a couple of words of introduction. I am an Italian citizen. I came to the United States in 2008. So it's important for you because this is how I see Vatican II in the United States, also in light of my experience in Italy and of studies in Germany, and one of the critical aspects to understand the pontificate of Pope Francis is the interpretation of Vatican II. This aspect plays a particularly delicate role in the relationship between Francis and the United States, because it is a tale of two receptions, or more than two receptions, of Vatican II. This paper will begin with the participation and reception of Vatican II by the US bishops, and then it will touch on some particular aspects, focusing on the role played especially by Gaudium et Spes, and I will leave out other aspects, especially the reception of Vatican II by academic theology in the United States, which is its own particular problem. And in the end, this paper will try and advance some hypotheses on the link between the reception of Pope Francis in the United States and the crisis in the reception of Vatican II in this church and in this country. So first part, the US bishops at Vatican II. The American bishops arrived at Vatican II not much better prepared than, for example, the Italians on the eve of the Second Vatican Council. Like the church historian Gerald Fogarty put it, quote, "Perhaps no hierarchy was as ill prepared for the Common Council as the American," end quote. However, a few issues like religious liberty and the tight boundaries between religious culture and American culture in the 20th century in the US prepared the US bishops for the change of Vatican II better than other national episcopates. The greatest practical experience of the American bishops concerned, for example, ecumenism and religious liberty, and thanks to Cardinal Spellman of New York, Bishop Carl Alter of Cincinnati, and the Jesuit Peritus John Curtin Murray, religious freedom became the American issue at Vatican II. After the conclave that elected Paul VI in June 1963, the US bishops became more united. Even though Vatican II was a learning experience for many US bishops, the mark they left was undoubtedly associated mostly with religious liberty. After Vatican II, thanks to the Council Declaration Dignitatis Humanae, quote, by Fogarty again, the American church no longer lived in the shadow of hypotheses. After Vatican II, it became clearer that different flocks of bishops had come to the council with different expectations and had returned to their diocese with different experiences, while other bishops had contributed to the council with an all-out theological engagement on a range of issues. The fruit of the previous decades of Nouvelle Théologie and pastoral renewal, the US bishops came to Rome clearly with a very short list of items on their agenda, while other bishops seemed to have an agenda that was sometimes, like for Italian bishops, no agenda at all. Unresponsive to the inquiry sent out by the Vatican in 1959 to receive feedback from the bishops on the Council's agenda, for example, the Italian bishops met collectively for the first time during Vatican II, while the US bishop had already a history of collective pastoral and theological action in their Episcopal Conference. All these different histories of the bishops of Vatican II were modified by the new breed of bishops appointed after Vatican II, especially after the rule about the resignation for 75-year-old bishops according to the intent of the conciliar decree Christus Dominus. Given that Vatican II did not modify the procedure for the appointment of bishops, despite some proposals that it should, the generation of bishops appointed after Vatican II had a particular impact on Catholicism in the United States. In the US, the apostolic delegate Jean Jadot made a significant contribution to the formation of those bishops responsible, for example, for the pastoral letters of the USCCB, the Challenge of Peace of 1983, and on Economic Justice for All of 1986. But most of all, the National Conference of US Bishops was responsible for managing reform that after Vatican II, in the words of Tom Rees, a very well-known Jesuit analyst, quote, "The American church did not experience a schism, and the bishops had been very successful adapting Episcopal Conference structures to the American political and cultural context," end quote. So Tom Rees wrote this 30 years ago. I'm not sure he would write that again today, right? In the US, the so-called Jadot bishops were soon replaced, starting in the 1980s, by a new draft of bishops more carefully chosen on the basis of their doctrinal loyalty to Humane Vitae and especially to John Paul's Magisterium of Life. Second part, the US lay people. The situation of the Catholic laity in the US is complex from an historical and sociological point of view, given that the post-Vatican II period was at the same time the definitive end of the so-called Catholic ghetto, and saw the entering of Catholics into mainstream American culture. Some, such as Notre Dame's Scott Appleby, have discussed, quote, "a post-conciliar thinning of American Catholicism," and so there's a longer quote here. "The concern is that the post-conciliar thinning of American Catholicism has eroded the Church's ability to operate with a sufficient degree of independence from the secular society. Headlong secularization seems more likely in the absence or weakening of countercultural Catholic presences as a regular feature in the lives of increasing numbers of laity." This is Scott Appleby in 2007. Others have suggested that the crisis was caused by the Roman rejection of an Americanization and democratization of church governance. As Timothy Kelly says, quote, "During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, a common vision dissipated, and church officials sought to reject the emerging model of the democratic church. The laity had moved too far to return to the church of the 1950s, however," end quote. And so chronologically earlier to other cases such as in Italy or France was the arrival in the United States of, for example, of a charismatic movement. This is something that happened here in the post-Vatican II earlier than in other countries. In contrast to the European cases, the emphasis in the US especially in the areas of the so-called liberal Catholicism and of women theology, was on the need for lay ministers and deacons, the issue of women in the priesthood, and the crisis of the Catholic intellectual magisterium, which in the US had taken the form of two different streams of Catholic intellectual traditions that are different for their view of political issues and of church, ecclesial, theological issues, which sometimes express themselves in the form of the so-called culture wars. And here I'm quoting for a very, very important sentence of a very important book that was published by one of the most important neoconservative intellectual, Richard John Newhouse, who in 1987 wrote this quote: "In all the changing definitions of sides and alignments, the contest over the interpretation of Vatican II constitutes a critical battlefront in our society's continuing cultural wars." End quote. That was basically an announcement. Vatican II in this country, the US, matters because we are fighting for what kind of culture we want to live in. This is a crucial point because the history of the reception of Vatican II in the US is inseparable from the history of the culture wars. In the US, the division between two or more than two different views of Vatican II and Vatican II Catholics somehow crystallized in the Catholic laity and became part of both the cultural and theological landscape of American Catholicism in a country that was clearly repudiating or struggling with secularism, at the same time that Europe was repudiating the association between pre-Vatican II Catholicism and pre-modern society. So here there is a gap in the chronology of the churches between Europe and the United States. The impact of the pontificate of John Paul II on the consolidation of the Catholic laity in the US in the 1980s is also worth analyzing very briefly. While in Europe the effort of the new evangelization touched only some areas of the bleeding national Catholic churches in Europe in a deeply secularized culture, in the United States, John Paul II's pontificate seemed to have labeled a process that was already underway at the moment of his election. And here, I believe Peter Steinfels, in his 2003 book, A People Adrift, was right, and he wrote this quote: "Beyond noting the differences between Paul VI and John Paul II's papacies, the prevailing stories of the council and its aftermath unfortunately differentiate very little between different stages. In the United States, the period of greatest turmoil was ending by the late 1970s. Consolidation in the United States was already underway when John Paul II's own agenda for consolidation began to kick in." End quote. And this is important because this is the 70s, the end of the 70s is the larger context. We should mention the political religious revival in this country, the new religious right that started with the presidency of Jimmy Carter in 1976. That says something on the diverging trajectories between US and European Catholicism, and most probably also Catholic churches in other continents in the post-conciliar period. Third section, which is the heart of my thesis, and there's some or many points of connections with Carlo Schickendan's lecture this morning. I argue that the crisis in the reception of Vatican II in the US is mostly a crisis in the reception of Gaudium et Spes, because the pastoral constitution plays a special role in Vatican II and plays a special role in the United States, this is a particular case in point. Gaudium et Spes is Vatican II's last word, and it addresses in a special way the issue of globalization of Catholicism in the contemporary world. The Pastoral Constitution plays a unique role in the intra-Catholic debate today because of the particular role of Vatican II and of Gaudium et Spes specifically for Pope Francis on the one hand, and on the other hand, because of the problematic relationship between Pope Francis and the Catholic Church in the US, what I've called in my first Pope Francis book, Pope Francis' American problem, which I believe is one of the hermeneutical keys to understand his pontificate in global Catholicism. Now, to understand the relationship between the Catholic Church in the US and Gaudium et Spes and the pastoral shift of the Church at Vatican II, it's necessary to take a look at the wider context, that is, at the points of friction, of tension, or worse, between the message of Gaudium et Spes and this large geocultural area of the world, which is US Catholicism, and I want to be very specific, not US Catholicism with Latino voice, right? So I just want to be very clear here. So a first point of difference between Gaudium et Spes and religion in North America of the white people is about the identification between religion and national identity, which is one of the legacies of the immigrant church and of the persistence of the national and ethnic churches in North America. Both the text and the spirit of Gaudium et Spes are ambivalent about the relationship between Christian identity and the duties of political citizenship, also because of the experiences of the ambiguous relationship between Catholics and authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. On the issue of religion and nationalism, Vatican II is distant, for example, from what Robert Bellah called the civil religion, as a system of established rituals, symbols, values, norms, and allegiances that build a political allegiance to the nation through religion. In Gaudium et Spes, the move is an opening of the traditional identification between Catholicism and a certain idea of the nation towards a more cosmopolitan, a more global articulation of the identity of Catholics in the modern world. It's not just that the thinkers and drafters of Gaudium et Spes came mostly from a European context, mostly from France, that after World War II rejected nationalism and especially religiously inspired nationalism. The difference is also that Gaudium et Spes opens to a plural and multicultural world, but still in the assumption of a fundamental unity between people, culture, and church in each local particular context. Gaudium et Spes acknowledges the modern state and its possible compatibility with Catholicism, but doesn't develop really the theme of pluralism, plurality within the modern state. Together with the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Gaudium et Spes closes the criticism against political modernity, accepting democracy, constitutionalism, human rights, and so forth. But Vatican II does not deal yet with the postmodern idea and experience of nation-state. Vatican II took place too early to be able to deal with a plurality and pluralism that radically redefine the legitimacy of public power in a way that's very different from the European truths stipulated between the 19th and the early 20th century between the Empire and its successors, and the churches that resulted in the modern European nation. And so this first point is important to understand why there's also a liberal crisis in the reception of Vatican II in the United States. Not only conservative. Vatican II is not postmodern enough for some liberal Catholics in the US. Second point of difference, I believe, is about the idea of culture. One of differences between Catholicism at Vatican II and today is that Catholics today experience a high degree of cultural, ethical, and political plurality, which, while already part of the Catholic experience worldwide during Vatican II, was not the experience of the drafters of Gaudium et Spes. And this is relevant for the importance of the idea of culture in Gaudium et Spes. On the one hand, Gaudium et Spes, Catholic theology and magisterium made peace with the relevance of culture for theology and for the development of the tradition. But on the other hand, there is in the Constitution a sense of unity between the Church and the world, but also a sense of unity of culture within one nation, one region, one social class or ethnic group that culminates in the unity of the human race. Gaudium et Spes 54. So here Gaudium et Spes is the document that comes before the postmodern breaking up of the idea of culture and its new place vis-a-vis the role of the theological tradition. In the pastoral constitution, the prevailing sense of culture is more in the sense of the German word Kultur, which is closer to civilization, and not in the sense of cultures in the plural. Today, the optimistic universality of the idea of culture in Gaudium et Spes has become a problem for Catholics in the US, especially because today culture, it's about the protection of an identity that is framed in a much more idiosyncratic way. The debate at Vatican II and in Gaudium et Spes is about the new balance between nature and grace. But the element of culture intervenes, I believe, out of the possible reach of the pastoral constitution. As British critic Terry Eagleton put it recently, culture has become, quote, a secular vision of divine grace, end quote. It's only in culture that you can receive grace. So this culturalization of the Catholic identity is a development that took place after the end of the Second Vatican Council and the debate leading to Gaudium et Spes. So this cultural critic of Gaudium et Spes is against a culturalization of Christianity, which is, I believe, a belittling of Christianity and of Catholicism and as a culture. As Vince Miller explained recently, quote, to think of the church in purely cultural terms runs the risk of accepting this disciplining of truth into sectarian niches that fundamentally compromises the church's Catholic mission. End quote. For Gaudium et Spes, the culturalist option is for Catholicism not only strategically but also theologically a mistake. Gaudium et Spes relativizes the claim of superiority of one culture, rejects the idea that there are uncivilized nations, and reframes the relationship between Jesus and culture, the church, and culture. Gaudium et Spes also prevents us from presenting Christianity or Catholicism in terms that are simply cultural and not theological. What happened after Vatican II, and I believe what happened to Gaudium et Spes in the United States, is that the discourse on culture and church has become really exclusive and not inclusive. And this had an impact not only on how we deal with the world outside of the church, but also within Catholicism, how we treat other Catholics. The biggest shift, however, is from a canonical idea of culture, one singular culture, to a more pluralistic and historical critical idea of cultures in the global church. So the Gaudium et Spes, it's a shift that still assumes that there is a consensus between us and does not assume the inevitability of the marginalization of the gospel. The issue of culture is particularly important in order to compare Gaudium et Spes and the attitude of many advocates of Catholicism in the West today that dream of a splendidly minoritarian Christianity in a hostile world. This is really part of the rejection of the Second Vatican Council, the idea that this world is only an enemy for the church and the retreat is the only possible option for the survival of the Catholic Church. This brings up a third point, which is, I believe, the issue of historicity. In Gaudium et Spes, the issue of culture is related to a new understanding of place and of time, that is, historicity and its relations to dogma. The mutual relationship between dogmatic language and historical awareness is reframed at Vatican II in the sense of a much more serious appreciation of how much dogma owes to history, and therefore how much history is important in the process of understanding the dogmatic tradition and the magisterium. The problem is that the historicity of the church is one of the ideas of the council that is received in different ways, in different cultural contexts, depending on the changing ways of looking at history or regimes of historicity. Not only because every different way of looking at history entails a framework of relationship with the past that has become something different between 1965 and 2016, but also because the European Catholic theology that mostly shaped Gaudium et Spes and North American culture today, there is a difference in terms of the role of history in the lived spiritual and cultural experiences of the church. The relationship with history in the North American context in the West is different from the one in other contexts and from the European context, the matrix of the Second Vatican Council in particular. It is not just the fact of a shorter history, a shorter historical past, but also a different relationship with the future, especially in North American religious culture, where fundamentalism can be seen not only as a specific way of relating to the past, but fundamentalism is also a symptom of the crisis of the future, of how we look at the future. This problem of Gaudium et Spes and historicity in the United States is part of the larger shift towards postmodernism, so which is the impossibility of reduced complexity to simple narratives, even of theological narratives. Now, Gaudium et Spes has a grand narrative that does not correspond simply with the American idea of progress, of endless possibilities. one of the main inspirators of the text, the French Dominican Marie-Dominique Chenoux, was very skeptical about the idea of a theology of progress. In Gaudium et Spes, there is not really a hermeneutics of history, an interpretation of history that is compatible with the American understanding of history, but there is a deep sense of historicity in the sense of the signs of the times, of Gaudium et Spes 4, like Carlos reminded us this morning. So Gaudium et Spes is difficult to understand for a certain North American mentality, I believe, because it's about coming to terms with the past more than anything else. It is part of the European Catholic culture effort to deal with the tragic past of the previous decades, especially between World War I and World War II, as well as with a Cold War and a possible global nuclear war seen from the European battleground. Now, all that said, it's undeniable that Vatican II and Gaudium et Spes have been received in the United States, especially, I would say, in the first 20 years after the end of the Council. The period between the full participation of U.S. Catholics in the civil rights movements in the mid-1960s and the letters of the U.S. bishops on nuclear war and on economic justice see an abundant use of Gaudium et Spes. Those two pastoral letters of the U.S. bishops of 1983 and 1986 represent, in my opinion, the highest moment in the reception of Vatican II in the teaching of the U.S. bishops in response to the urgent issues of their time. There, Gaudium et Spes plays a key role, together with other documents, of the Second Vatican Council. But then, in the mid-80s, something happens, and it's a reception that changes after the mid-80s, with the pontificate of John Paul II and the influence of Joseph Ratzinger on the pontificate that shapes the beginning of a different phase in the role of the pastoral constitution in the church in the United States. This is part of a complex relationship between two church leaders, John Paul II and the future Benedict XVI, with different considered experiences and, importantly, with different interpretations of Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes is for Wojtyła something different than it's for Ratzinger. But there's no question that there is a John Paul II, Benedict XVI deep imprint in the North American context that redraws almost completely the ecclesial and theological map in this country in the last 35 years, more or less. Its trajectory leads in the early 2000s to the pre-election document of the USCCB Faithful Citizenship, approved in 2007 and updated in 2011. And as far as I know, there's no update that has been published yet, and I'm not sure it will be before the election of next year. Now, I believe that to understand the crisis of the reception of Vatican II in the US, we need, or this is my impression, we should look at the Catholic Church in the United States as an exceptional case. One major difference between the receptions of Vatican II in Europe and in North America seems to be, for example, the use of the label Vatican II to define specific kinds of Catholics. Vatican II Catholicism, Vatican II Catholics. While European churches, and I'm curious to hear from you about Latin America, during at least the 2 decades after the end of Vatican II seem to have accepted, except for the Lefebvrites, in a rather nominalistic way sometimes Vatican II as their cultural and theological identity, in the United States, Vatican II Catholics means something very specific and seem to have become much sooner a specific and not universally welcome definition or self-definition. While in other continents, the self-definition Catholic often require an adjective, in the range of adjective there was not much available room, paradoxically, for Vatican II as often and as meaningfully as it was in the US. And so Carlos, just a couple of hours ago, says that everyone in Latin America is more or less a Vatican II Catholic, even if sometimes, as we say in Italy, per tirare l'acqua al suo mulino. I think you understand that. This is not the United States. Here, Vatican II is very specific, and it's very visible that there is an anti-Vatican II movement. So this result doesn't come as a surprise. While the debate in the United States on the relationship between Catholicism and American culture had received a boost from the conciliar view of culture, thus creating a real kind of enculturation of Catholicism in the culture of the Western Hemisphere, for post-Vatican II European scholars, that has become exculturation. And so this is a fundamental gap. European Catholic scholarship has accepted that there is a detachment between Christianity and culture. The US is arriving at that awareness right now. And this is the crisis, that it's not that easy to have a Catholic church in a post-Christian culture. This is why this crisis in the Catholic Church in the United States. And then finally, I have to add one fundamental fact that has shaped the different processes in the reception of the Second Vatican Council between Europe and North America. This is the impact of immigration and on the social and cultural landscapes of Catholicism. In Europe, after Vatican II, 20, 30 years after Vatican II, the arrival of mostly Muslim migrant populations injected from the 1980s on the fear of an elimination of the Christian roots of Europe, so-called Christian roots of Europe, and the nightmare of the creation of a Eurabia. And this fear is at the origin of the political fortunes of the new right-wing and nativist parties in Central Europe. But at the same time, for American Catholicism, the impact of immigration from Latin America had an invigorating effect that has been totally lacking in the European churches, not only in terms of concealing the membership losses of the descendants of European Catholics, but also in terms of the contribution to the cultural reinterpretation of American Catholicism. But this is where we are now, because that invigorating effect in the US church is radically changing the majority population of this church in North America with a very different understanding of Vatican II. And this is why the crisis in the US is not just theological, but it's also social and ethnic. Now, here there are, I believe, patterns of transatlantic exchanges in the late 20th century Catholicism that are not separable from the attempt to understand different Catholic mindsets. If in North America we have a lot of soul-searching about Catholicism and American culture and a new enculturation of Catholic identity, this is, I believe, a unique American situation where the Catholic crisis is also a national crisis. The crisis in the reception of Pope Francis in the US is a reflection of a national crisis. Now, this new enculturation seems to have brought about a cultural rift, if not a polarization, between different identities within American Catholicism around the interpretation of Vatican II. This gap in different cultural destinies of Catholicism after Vatican II has brought to the US a greater perception of Europe as a mere depository of a past that can be used in variable ways. And this is a very big change from Vatican II, when European culture was essentially Catholic culture, coessential almost. European Christianity has become unusable for liberal Catholics, except for the years of the Second Vatican Council, usable, but mostly in a narrow perspective. Europe is good until the 19th century, and preferably in the Middle Ages, but after that it's an unusable past. But there are also other gaps that say something on the crisis of the reception of the Council in the US, is that from the US, the highly symbolical issues of Vatican II American theology, such as the role of women in the church and women theology going towards women ordination, really never managed to make it in Europe, not even in the circles of Vatican II Catholics, with the same intensity that these issues have on this side, on the Atlantic. On the other side, after the 1990s, the vitality of conservative American Catholicism has become more and more appealing for conservative European Catholics, and we have a globalization of the American cultural wars. And so this has arrived in Europe completely in these last 10 or 15 years. Now, here a few conclusions in the sense of two conclusions and three hypotheses. So what is typical of the reception of Vatican II in the North American context are, in my opinion, two things mostly. On the one hand, there is a scarcity of theological commentaries on Vatican II produced in the United States in English. One could wonder whether the reception of the Council has been more cultural, social, and political than directly theological and historiographical. In other words, Gaudium Spes has shaped the development of American Catholic theology after Vatican II with a commitment to a certain idea of Vatican II as a whole, as a spirit, as an energy, as a dream, but without an intellectual commitment to the studies of Vatican II as a corpus and as an act. This is something shocking if one knows how much resources American Catholic universities have, for example. The lack of studies and commentaries on the pastoral constitution, for example, is telling of a reception of Vatican II in the US that since the very beginning was oriented toward a situation that most theologians perceived as developing quickly towards a post-Vatican II. In the US, Vatican II becomes old instantly as soon as it ends. And this is still, I believe, our problem, or it is part of the problem of the Council in the United States. And then, second, it's the most visible feature, which is the divisiveness of the reception of Vatican II, mostly at the level of academic theology and intellectual circles, more than at the level of the people of God. And I've said that many times, and the more I live in this country, the more convinced I become of this. It's a divisiveness about the interpretation of Vatican II that is more profound in the US than anywhere else in the world. I don't know about the outer space and Mars, but this is a phenomenon that remains to be investigated, especially for the relation between this divisiveness and what I would say the lack of a tradition of studies on Vatican II in this country. There's no institution that is known for having published editions of documents, of manuscripts, of commentaries, and so on. So this is a couple of preliminary conclusion that will require real research, leading possibly also to a history, for example, of the political cultures of US Catholics in the post-Vatican II period. There are, however, other three things that I think is worth mentioning very briefly for the development of an understanding of what happened to Vatican II in this country. A first hypothesis is that there is obviously a particular connection between the way Vatican II was received in the Catholic Church globally and the social political context of one local particular church. So Vatican II elaborates on the new opening to the world in a cultural context in which the relations between the church and modern culture change after Vatican II in the US, much more than they change in Europe, I believe. The European context was the background of the changes described by Vatican II in the Pastoral Constitution. Because of a delay in the secularization of the US culture, US politics, the changes happening in the role of the church and of religion in the United States is blamed on Vatican II. And so now Vatican II gets the blame for our secularization, which is, I believe, hermeneutically incorrect, but this is politically and socially a very powerful argument. It's as if the social ills of this country were imported from Vatican II with a 50 years delay. This is, I believe, at the heart of the divided reception of Vatican II, and especially of Gaudium Spes. Second hypothesis has to do with the role of the theological reflection in a church like this one in the United States, which is, I believe, a Vatican II church. But from a mere bibliographical point of view, it's worth mentioning here that the reception of Vatican II in the US took place especially after the mid-80s, when a few symptoms of the crisis become visible. It's a reception that takes place without a substantial investment from the Catholic academia in the theological meaning of Vatican II for the intellectual, spiritual, and cultural tradition of American Catholicism. The weakness of the theological reflection on the history and theology of the Council left the Christological shift of Vatican II at the mercy of a totally political theological spin that grew louder as the Church became chronologically more distant from the event of Vatican II. So that's why I think things will get worse before they get better. In this sense, it is impossible to overestimate the impact, especially in the US, of John O'Malley's book of 2008, What Happened at Vatican II. It's a book that literally saved the debate on Vatican II in the English-speaking world. The reception of Gaudium et Spes is the symbol of the divided reception of the council, and especially of the ecclesiology of the council in the United States. Third and final hypothesis: there is a correspondence between the reception of Vatican II in the US and the difficult reception of Pope Francis in this country. Francis' pontificate coincides not only with a new phase in the reception of the council. His pontificate is also clearly coincides with a departure from a US-centered world. This element is particularly important because the fracture between the US Catholic conservatism on the one side and Francis' pontificate is not the cause, but it's the consequence of what I would call an interruption in the Americanization of Roman Catholicism. In the 1980s, 1990s, until Pope Francis, we saw, I believe, the attempt of make of global Catholicism something that looked really like US Catholicism. US Catholicism as a model for the future of Roman Catholicism globally. In some sense, the US already had its first pope, or maybe two, John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. They were the most US appealing popes, much more than Francis, you know. The history of the pontificate and its transatlantic relations can be seen as a series of fractures and tensions which are the product of different interruptions. I think Pope Francis is fundamentally an interruption in the history of the Catholic Church. The response of the global church to the interruption in the reception of Vatican II in very important hierarchical, intellectual, political, financial groups in the United States was the election of Francis. Francis wakes them up from their dream. On the other hand, there is an interruption of the Americanization of Catholicism with his vision for a truly global Catholic Church. Pope Francis interrupts the globalization of the American cultural wars. So what I think this pontificate means is a very difficult time for him and for those like us who try to work this pontificate and help this church, but it's also a great moment of revelation and of solution of tensions that have been built. And in this sense, Vatican II is not just a relic of the past. It's something that is really the compass for this global Catholic Church. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.